Good morning, everybody. And overnight, Iran's rhetoric machine crossed a line it hadn't crossed in this entire war, threatening a ground invasion of a sovereign Gulf state that has nothing to do with the fight over the strait. And the American response to that threat has been building for days now in a way that a lot of people haven't been tracking closely enough. So today we're breaking down exactly what Iran said about Kuwait, why the language they used is setting off alarm bells with analysts who study this region for a living, what the US and Kuwaiti militaries have actually unleashed in response, and where the real line is between genuine kinetic escalation and just another round of regime rhetoric. Then stick around for the global roundup because there's a lot happening outside Kuwait too. Let's get into it. Here's how we got here. Iran doesn't share a land border with Kuwait. Never has. So when regime-aligned voices in Tehran started floating the idea of a ground incursion to seize American bases inside Kuwaiti territory, the first question everybody should be asking is the same one analysts are asking right now, which is how exactly? The answer being discussed is that any Iranian ground force would have to cross Iraqi territory to get there, which is its own enormous complication, both politically and logistically. But the language coming out of Tehran has genuinely escalated. Reporting out of the region says Iranian voices are openly discussing seizing 3 specific American positions: Camp Buehring, Camp Arifjan, and Ali al-Salem Air Base, and even floating the idea of taking American troops hostage. One analysis piece drew a direct comparison between recent statements from Iran's Tasnim news agency and the language Baghdad used in the run-up to the actual 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which, if you know your Gulf history, is about as loaded a historical comparison as you can make in that part of the world. Kuwait's Emir, Mishal al-Ahmad al-Jaber al-Sabah, has already said publicly that his country is facing an unprovoked attack from what he called a neighboring Muslim country his government considers a friend, one it never allowed to be used as a staging ground for any military action against Iran. That's about as clear a statement as a head of state can make that this isn't a war Kuwait asked for or wants any part of. And it's worth sitting with that 1990 comparison for a second longer, because it's not a throwaway line, it's a very deliberate one. Kuwait's entire modern national identity is built around the memory of Saddam Hussein's invasion, the 7-month occupation, and the American-led coalition that eventually rolled it back. Every Gulf state security planner alive today came up professionally studying that war as the reference case for what happens when a much larger regional power decides a small, oil-wealthy neighbor is fair game. So when regime-aligned Iranian media starts using language that echoes the justifications Baghdad used before 1990, framing the American presence inside Kuwait as an existential provocation rather than a defensive arrangement that predates this entire conflict by decades, that's not an accident of phrasing. That's either a genuine strategic signal that Tehran is contemplating something it hasn't tried before, or it's psychological pressure specifically engineered to spook a country that has that exact historical trauma sitting closer to the surface than almost anywhere else in the region. Either way, it's a deliberate choice of words, and the people running Kuwait's foreign ministry know it. And this isn't purely rhetorical anymore either, which is the part that makes it different from a lot of the noise we've heard out of Tehran over the last several months. Back in May, Kuwaiti security forces intercepted what's being described as an IRGC-linked infiltration team attempting to breach Bubiyan Island, a strategically sensitive port zone up near the Iraqi frontier. 4 operatives were captured after a firefight that wounded a Kuwaiti soldier. That's a real, physical, on-the-ground event, not a press release. Bubiyan itself is worth understanding for a second because it's not some random patch of coastline. It's Kuwait's largest island, sitting right up against the Iraqi border at the top of the Gulf, connected to the mainland by a causeway and home to the newer Mubarak al-Kabir port project that Kuwait has spent years developing as a future economic hub. Strategically, whoever controls access to that stretch of coastline controls a meaningful piece of the northern approach into the Gulf, which is exactly why a probing infiltration attempt there, rather than somewhere more remote, reads as more than a random skirmish to people who study this terrain closely. Kuwaiti officials have not publicly detailed everything the captured operatives were carrying, or what their specific objective was, and that ambiguity is itself part of the story, because it leaves room for exactly the kind of escalation narrative Tehran has been building ever since. Analysts studying this conflict have been careful to separate what's actually happened from what's just been threatened, and even the most sober assessments out there are treating that Bubiyan incident as the only verified instance of Iranian personnel physically crossing into Kuwaiti-claimed territory this entire war. Everything past that, the talk of a full-ground invasion, the hostage rhetoric, sits in a different category, hawkish political signaling from regime-aligned figures rather than confirmed operational movement. But signaling matters too, especially when it escalates this fast, and especially when it's layered on top of a very real, ongoing bombardment campaign against Kuwaiti soil that's already been running for weeks. Because here's what's actually been landing on Kuwait, and this part isn't rhetoric at all. Iran has repeatedly struck Ali al-Salem Air Base directly, hitting a drone facility, early warning radar, and communications infrastructure there in an attack that CENTCOM and Kuwaiti officials both confirmed. Kuwait's Ministry of Electricity, Water, and Renewable Energy has reported that a power generation and desalination plant came under attack not once, but twice in a 2-day span, with fire breaking out at the facility both times. That matters more than it might sound like on paper, because roughly 90% of Kuwait's drinking water comes from desalination, and this is happening during the single hottest stretch of the year in the Gulf. Kuwait's defense ministry said its air defenses intercepted 32 drones in a single overnight window earlier this month. Satellite imagery has shown smoke rising from an oil facility in Ahmadi Governorate after an Iranian strike. This is not a country caught in incidental crossfire. This is a sustained, deliberate campaign against Kuwaiti civilian and military infrastructure, running in parallel with the invasion rhetoric, and that combination, real strikes plus escalating hostage and invasion talk, is exactly why analysts who track prediction markets on this conflict have been watching the odds shift. One market, tracking the odds of further Iranian military action against a Gulf state on a single day this week, priced that at better than 50% likely, while pricing a full-scale ground invasion of Kuwait by the end of the month at under 3%. That gap tells you almost everything. The strikes are real and ongoing. The invasion talk, for now, is priced by the people who study this stuff for a living as very unlikely to become an actual ground campaign. So now let's get to what the US and Kuwaiti side has actually unleashed in response, because there's a real story here that's been quietly building for days. First, on pure air defense, this hasn't been a passive wait-and-see posture. 32 drones intercepted in a single night is not a skeleton crew scrambling to keep up. That's a layered air defense picture working the way it's designed to work. And it's happening alongside the broader Patriot and THAAD coverage the US has kept forward deployed across the Gulf states, specifically, because Iran's missile and drone playbook has been the defining feature of this entire war. Second, and this is the piece that connects directly back to the 12th consecutive night of CENTCOM strikes on Iran that wrapped up in the early hours of today, the American answer to Iran threatening to seize bases inside Kuwait hasn't been to sit still and defend in place. It's been to keep systematically degrading the exact capability Iran would need to make good on any of that rhetoric in the first place. CENTCOM's own language on that 12th night described the targets as Iranian maritime capabilities, missile and drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and air defense assets. Every single one of those categories is directly relevant to whether Iran could actually project any kind of force toward Kuwait by sea, by air, or by proxy, let alone move ground troops across Iraqi territory to get there. You don't invade a neighboring country's airbase while your own drone storage facilities and command infrastructure are getting hit every single night for going on 2 weeks straight. There's also the reinforcement side of this, which doesn't always get the same attention as the strike footage, but matters just as much. This war has already seen the Pentagon weigh sending thousands of additional troops into the region as it's escalated in phases, and Gulf allies haven't been sitting this one out either. Italy and Canada both have forces stationed inside Kuwait that have already taken fire during this conflict, with a Canadian position at Ali al-Salem sustaining damage during one Iranian strike, and Australia separately deploying forces to the UAE at that government's request specifically to help defend Gulf states and their own bases. So the picture inside Kuwait right now isn't just American assets standing alone against Iranian rhetoric. It's a genuinely multinational defensive posture, sitting behind layered air defense, backed by a strike campaign against Iran itself that's specifically targeting the tools Iran would need to make any invasion threat real. I want to sit on that multinational piece for a second longer, because it doesn't get nearly enough attention in the day-to-day coverage of this war. When people picture the American military response to Iran, they picture American jets, American carriers, American troops. What's actually sitting on the ground in Kuwait right now is a genuinely layered coalition. You've got the American footprint across Buehring, Arifjan, and Ali al-Salem, which have functioned as logistics and staging hubs for the wider region for decades. You've got Italian and Canadian units stationed alongside them, both of which have already taken incoming fire this war without a single fatality between them, which honestly says a lot about how seriously their own force protection posture has been taken, given how much ordnance has been thrown in their direction. And you've got Australia separately committing forces into the UAE at Emirati request specifically to help backstop Gulf state defense, which tells you this isn't a war where allies are quietly sitting on the sidelines waiting to see how it plays out. When Tehran threatens to march on Kuwaiti soil and take American troops hostage, it isn't just threatening Washington. It's threatening a coalition that already has skin in this game and has already buried some of its own personnel because of it. If you want the deeper strategic framework behind how coalitions like this actually get built and held together under fire, that's a big part of what I get into in the book. Links below. I'd really appreciate you checking it out. Now back to it. Let's talk tactics for a second on how that layered defense actually works together, because it's worth understanding the machinery behind those 32 intercepted drones instead of just treating it as a number. You've got Patriot batteries providing the workhorse mid-tier intercept capability against both drones and shorter-range ballistic threats. THAAD sitting above that as the higher altitude layer built specifically to catch ballistic missiles in their terminal phase before they can reach the ground. And underneath all of that, you've got shorter-range point defense systems designed to catch whatever slips through the first two layers. That's the standard doctrine for defending a fixed, high-value site like an airbase against exactly the kind of saturation drone and missile mix Iran has been throwing at Gulf targets all war. None of these systems are unlimited, and that's worth being honest about, because every intercept uses an expensive interceptor round against what's often a cheap Iranian drone, which is a cost equation that favors the attacker over a long enough timeline. That's part of why CENTCOM's strategy hasn't just been to sit behind that shield and absorb the exchange rate. It's been to go on offense against the launch sites, the storage depots, and the drone production infrastructure itself, so that Iran runs out of things to throw before Kuwait and its allies run out of things to catch them with. It's also worth remembering that Kuwait has already paid a real price earlier in this war, which is exactly why nobody there is treating the current escalation lightly. Back when Operation Epic Fury first kicked off, Iranian missiles struck a makeshift operations center near the civilian port of Shuaiba, killing American service members and wounding dozens more, with a large share of the wounded requiring hospitalization. Kuwaiti Navy personnel have died in the line of duty during this conflict as well. There was even a friendly fire incident during that chaotic early stretch of the war, where a Kuwaiti Air Force jet brought down 3 American F-15Es, with all the American aircrew surviving, a grim reminder of just how much confusion a saturation missile and drone attack can create even for well-coordinated Allied forces working the same airspace. Canadian troops stationed at Ali al-Salem have taken shelter in bunkers during strikes and sustained facility damage, which triggered its own round of political criticism back home over how transparent Ottawa had been about troops being in harm's way. So when people talk about Kuwait as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for American power projection into the wider region, that's not just a strategic label. It's a description of a country that has already absorbed real casualties and real infrastructure damage, specifically because of the American and Allied presence on its soil, months before anyone in Tehran started talking about invasion. If you're into this kind of breakdown of how modern layered air defense actually gets built and paid for in real time during an active war, this is exactly the kind of thing I get into in the book, links in the description. I'd really appreciate you checking it out. You made it to the global roundup, my friends, so let's cover what else is happening outside the Kuwait story specifically. CENTCOM's 12th consecutive night of strikes also reportedly hit targets tied to Iran's operations near Buehring, with a strike on a power substation near the nuclear plant itself briefly cutting electricity to a nearby village before power was restored a couple of hours later. Iranian media separately reported strikes overnight near Awaz in Khuzestan province, and Iranian outlets say a strike near the passenger terminal at the Shalamche border crossing with Iraq killed 2 people, citing a security official. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told the Senate Appropriations Committee this week that the war's total cost has now reached roughly $37.5 billion, in testimony where he sparred directly with Democratic senators, questioning whether the stated goal of dismantling Iran's military has actually been achieved. Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell confirmed close to 100 American service members have been injured since strikes resumed on July 7th, the large majority of those minor concussions, with the vast majority already back on duty. Iraq separately shut down every crude oil loading terminal at its main southern export hub this week after a drone struck a tanker there, with nobody claiming responsibility, adding yet another choke point to a regional oil picture already strained by the Strait of Hormuz closure and the reinstated blockade on Iranian ports. And a magnitude earthquake struck Kermanshah in western Iran this week as well, an entirely natural event with no connection to the strikes, but worth flagging given how much regional infrastructure is already under strain. And I want to flag one more item here without any jokes attached to it, because it isn't a joke. Iranian authorities have continued executing detainees connected to last winter's nationwide protests, including 2 young men hanged in Isfahan on July 19th and another execution reported on July 22nd. Human rights monitors say roughly 10 more detainees tied to the same case remain at imminent risk, and that this is happening on a completely separate track from the military side of this conflict. It deserves to be understood as its own story, not a footnote to the war headlines, and I'd encourage anyone following this conflict to keep an eye on that, reporting independently of anything CENTCOM puts out. You made it to the 40,000-foot strategic analysis section, and I think the single most useful thing I can hand you here isn't a prediction, it's a framework, because it's the same one the more careful analysts covering this Kuwait story are using themselves. Every single claim coming out of this conflict needs to get sorted into one of 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is verifiable kinetic events, things that actually happened and can be confirmed, like the Bubiyan Island infiltration attempt, the strikes on Ali al-Salem, the hits on the desalination plant, the 32 drones intercepted in a night. Bucket 2 is hawkish, political rhetoric from regime-aligned figures, which is where the invasion talk, the hostage talk, and the Tasnim language echoing 1990 all currently sit. And Bucket 3 is speculative strategic analysis, which is analysts and commentators, myself included, connecting dots and making informed judgment calls about where this might be headed, which is useful, but should never get confused with confirmed fact. Right now, Bucket 1 shows a real and escalating bombardment campaign against Kuwaiti infrastructure, paired with one confirmed cross-border infiltration attempt months ago. Bucket 2 shows genuinely alarming rhetoric that's escalated faster in the last week than at almost any other point in this war. And Bucket 3, where the prediction markets and the regional analysts mostly land, says the actual probability of Iranian ground forces crossing into Kuwait remains low, single digits low, specifically because Iran has no land border to get there with, and because every night of continued CENTCOM strikes is chipping away at the exact capability that kind of operation would require. Let's actually walk through why Bucket 3 lands where it does, because it's not just a gut feeling, there's real reasoning behind it. For Iran to move any meaningful ground force toward Kuwait, it would almost certainly need to transit Iraqi territory. And Iraq's own government has its own relationship with Washington, its own sovereignty concerns, and its own reasons not to want to become the staging corridor for an Iranian move against a neighbor. That alone is a massive diplomatic and logistical obstacle that has nothing to do with whether Iran's military is even capable of the operation in the first place. Then there's the capability question itself. A conventional ground invasion requires armor, sustained logistics, air cover to protect that armor while it moves, and none of those things exist in a vacuum. They exist on top of a military that has spent the better part of 5 months getting its coastal defenses, its command centers, its missile storage, and its air defense assets hit on a nightly basis. You don't stage a mechanized column across hostile or neutral territory while your own air defense picture back home is this degraded, because whatever air cover you'd need for that column is the exact same air power that's been getting systematically dismantled since February. And finally, there's the math on what Iran would actually gain versus what it would risk. A failed or even partially successful ground incursion into a Gulf state hosting American, Italian, and Canadian troops would almost certainly trigger a coalition response several orders of magnitude larger than what's already happening. At a moment when Iran's own leadership, freshly reshuffled after the death of the supreme leader, is already managing internal fractures over whether to keep fighting at all. All of that is exactly why the smart money, literally, in the case of that prediction market, is pricing this as psychological pressure dressed up as a war plan rather than an actual war plan. That doesn't mean the psychological pressure play is harmless or something to shrug off, though. And this is where I think a lot of casual coverage of this story gets it wrong. Rhetoric like this has a real target audience, and it isn't really the Pentagon. It's Kuwaiti public opinion. It's the other Gulf states watching to see how Kuwait responds. And it's the negotiating table itself, wherever that ends up being. If Tehran can get Kuwait's population nervous enough, or get other Gulf capitals quietly pressuring Washington to wind this down before it spreads further, that's a win for Iran that costs them nothing but a press statement, especially compared to the price of an actual military campaign they almost certainly cannot sustain or win. So the real signal to watch for isn't another angry statement out of Tehran. It's any confirmed movement of Iranian ground forces, naval transport assets, or rotary wing units toward the northern Gulf littoral, any indication that Iraqi territory is actually being used as a staging corridor rather than just being invoked rhetorically, or any second physical infiltration attempt following the pattern of what happened at Bubiyan back in May. Until one of those shows up in Bucket 1, this stays a rhetorical escalation sitting on top of a very real bombardment campaign, not a ground war in the making. And the job for anybody following this conflict closely is to keep watching that line rather than getting swept up every time a regime-aligned account posts something new. What do you think? Do you think Iran is bluffing to rattle the Gulf states into pressuring Washington toward a ceasefire? Or do you think this rhetoric is building toward something more concrete? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. If you want more of this kind of framework for separating real signal from noise in a fast-moving conflict, the book's linked below, and I'd really appreciate you checking it out. Follow along on X and Instagram. I'm posting extra breakdowns there most days, and I'll see you in the next one.